In Tunisia, an exceptional archaeological site dominates the Mediterranean Sea. Carthage. It was one of the largest cities of the Roman Empire, a rival even to Rome itself, thanks to its incredible monuments. Its thermal baths were among the largest in the empire.
These were baths for prestige. You know, the Romans liked to show off.
Its aqueduct was more than 18 miles long.
The aqueducts are perhaps what best illustrate Roman engineering and its superiority over other civilizations in the Mediterranean world.
But then there was the bloodthirsty spectacle of its amphitheater.
When you look at the amphitheater, it's majestic. But what happened in has nothing to do with civilization.
But Carthage hides an ancient secret. In its bowels lie the remains of another city, founded 7 centuries earlier by one of the most fascinating civilizations of ancient times.
The Phoenicians had the navy in the 3rd millennium BC. The Phoenicians did the tour of Africa in 600 BC, when Rome was just a slum.
Carthage reigned supreme over the Mediterranean, thanks to its incredible harbor.
On the island were workshops where ships were built on an almost industrial scale.
So how did it just disappear? Why did the Romans try to erase all traces of it? This is the incredible story of the 2 Carthages. The history of Carthage begins with a legend said to date from the 9th century BC in Phoenicia, a region that corresponds to present-day Lebanon. Pygmalion, the new power-hungry king of Tyre, is said to have murdered his brother-in-law in order to seize his wealth. The latter's wife, Elissa, then fled, taking with her a fabulous treasure. Accompanied by a band of her followers, she boarded a ship that took her to the coast of the Gulf of Tunis.
This lady didn't, go like that, have a picnic somewhere, She chose the Gulf of Tunis because we are close to Sicily. If you lock the channel between Sicily and Tunisia, you control the Mediterranean.
Founding a city there meant they could control the valuable trade routes between East and West.
For the Phoenicians, trade had always been their compass. Ever since the merchants traveled far and wide to explore the Mediterranean, where many of them settled. And wherever they could, wherever the trading was good, a Phoenician diaspora developed.
So they are known, much like now the Lebanese of nowadays. You would put a Lebanese anywhere in the world, you can create a business. The know-how, they are entrepreneurs. They are people who don't have many resources, but from nothing they can create wealth.
They chose a piece of land that stretched between a lake and the sea.
She arrived in a land where there was a Berber king. It was not a wild country. And she asked a land as big as an ox hide.
The Berber reckoned he was smarter than her, and he agreed. But in fact, she was the clever one.
Elissa took a knife and cut that skin into thin strips and stretched those strips all around a very big piece of land. That was to be the birthplace of ancient Carthage. The legend tells that that's why the hill in the city is called Byrsa, because in Greek, Byrsa means cowhide.
The hill of Byrsa is nearly 200 feet high, large enough to build a citadel on. But the story may not be as simple as the legend suggests.
Many parts of the story are definitely not historical facts. And that the founder of the city was called Elisa is probably as implausible as the idea that she was exiled from Tyre.
And it's not because of a dispute between a brother and a sister that the city is founded. The city was a colony, means that you take Tyrian citizens and you move them to another place. So Carthage was a part of Tyre.
Thanks to its many assets, the young city of Carthage became a promised land for Phoenicians from all over the Mediterranean. Soon it would give birth to a whole new civilization, the Punic civilization, which would rival the Greeks in power and the Persians in wealth. In the 8th century BC, Carthage stretched from the seashore with its shops and workshops to the top of the hill of Byrsa, protected by a solid wall.
Generally, when the Phoenicians settled in a place, you have always the low city and the high city, like the Greeks. The high city is a place where people found, refuge in case of an attack, and the low city close to the sea. And this is the case of Carthage.
On the hill of Byrsa, little trace now remains of the foundations of Carthage. They've all been swept away by centuries of destruction. Luckily, though, nearly 40 miles away, on the Cap Bon Peninsula, an exceptional archaeological site offers a unique example of Punic architecture. Carthage. Founded on the Carthaginian model in the 6th century BC, its remains are still intact, ever since it was abandoned over 2,000 years ago.
Carthage was a small settlement founded by the Phoenicians north of Carthage. It was most likely a city where mainly craftsmen lived. It was a kind of industrial site that worked for and helped to supply Carthaginian traders in the Mediterranean.
The city was made up of blocks of houses separated by a grid of wide streets.
Here we are in the heart of the city of Carthage. This, for example, is the street of the craftsmen, with shops and workshops. We're just a few meters from the public square, which also served as a market and meeting place. This whole layout of the city is the same as the pattern of Punic Carthage that we know today.
Just like in Carthage, the mud brick dwellings were several stories high and built around large courtyards with rooms leading off them.
Here, we're in the noble wing of this house. It's a ceremonial room with this paving called Punic paving, made up of the same small white tesserae that are used in Roman mosaics.
The walls are covered with a plaster made from shells of marine mollusks. But what's most surprising is how comfortable these houses are, as evidenced by this incredibly well-preserved bathroom.
This is what's known as a clog bathtub. It has a coating made from a mixture of sand, lime, and crushed ceramic that makes it to a degree waterproof. It's to be found in all the houses, which suggests that water played an important role in the way of life of people here.
Thanks to Kerguan, archaeologists know a lot more about the Punic civilization, and through that, about Carthage. With its airy streets and luxurious villas, this was undoubtedly one of the most sophisticated cities at a time when Rome was still a simple village. It seemed that nothing could stop its steady rise. In the 6th century BC, Tyre was besieged and then conquered by the king of Babylon. Now Carthage was the leading commercial power in the Mediterranean.
Carthage would trade with everyone. They sold some of the luxury goods that came from sub-Saharan Africa, such as ivory and gold, but also slaves. It was all part of the Carthaginian trade.
To secure its hold on the trade routes, Carthage took control of Phoenician trading posts in the Mediterranean, in places like Libya, Sicily, or Sardinia, thus becoming the head of a veritable empire. It was now one of the main metropolises on the Mediterranean. The hill of Byrsa was too small now to contain the limits of the city, which now stretched right down to the sea.
Carthage could hold its head up alongside Rome, Alexandria, or Athens. It was a very wealthy, very prosperous city. Because, of course, in a city like Carthage, there were large numbers of foreigners. Wealthy foreigners like Greeks, Egyptians, and Romans.
Such riches could whet the appetite of other, hungrier kingdoms. So to protect themselves, the Carthaginians built an enclosure facing the sea. Excavations have uncovered the remains of sandstone blocks weighing several tons each.
These foundation blocks of the wall date back to the 5th century BC. They are valuable evidence because we don't know much about the city's defenses. Appian, writing in the 2nd century, gives a description of them. The rampart, which was about 30 cubits high, that's about 50 feet, and the towers, which were 4 stories high. So there was still a very important system of defenses, and a colossal one at that.
But it was the other side of the city that had the most impressive ramparts.
The western wall was in fact a triple wall, 9 meters thick, doubled by a ditch. And one of them even contained stalls for elephants.
While the Carthaginian defenses were impressive in their scale, one question remains: where did they find such quantities of stone? The answer lies on the Cap Bon Peninsula, in the quarries of El Huaria. Here, the rock was mined for more than 500 years, gradually transforming the landscape.
Here we are in a cave. Not a natural cave, but a cave that's been carved out by man.
Some of these cavities are more than 65 feet deep and were dug out layer after layer by troops of slaves. On the walls, you can still see the traces they left here more than 2,500 years ago.
You can see here these small cavities cut perpendicular to the rock, which allowed workers in the caves to go down and go back up again.
Equipped only with a simple iron pick, they tirelessly dug out all the stone.
Here, it's not limestone, it's consolidated dune sandstone, very easy to carve. They would just crack the rock face somehow, and the boulder would come tumbling down.
The stones were then taken down to the shore and transported by sea to Carthage, nearly 40 miles away. And among the buildings they'd be used to build was the huge port complex. It was over half a mile long and 300 yards wide, and its basins were dug to a depth of almost 10 feet.
In the time of Carthage, the concept of jetties didn't exist, so they emptied the land and they included the harbor within the walls of their town.
That's a typical Phoenician thing. The ports of Carthage were made of stone hewn out of the solid rock.
These titanic works, carved out by human hands, still mark the landscape 2,300 years later. Open to the sea, the first basin housed the port, dedicated to trade. It was composed of quays and huge warehouses. But the most impressive was the military port. In the shape of a ring with a diameter of 1,000 feet, it concealed at its center the 350-yard-wide islet of the Admiralty.
From this islet, an admiral could monitor and control everything that was going on around the harbor, while anyone outside the harbor couldn't see what was going on inside it.
It was a top-secret place, invisible from the outside.
This circular port was closed off by a chain. The gate was about 22 yards wide to accommodate warships.
The ring had 140 boat slipways, while the central island had 30. One of the dry docks was found during the excavations. Its slightly sloping ramp of wooden logs made it easy to launch ships. Its width and length correspond exactly to that of a Phoenician galley, known as a trireme.
On the island were workshops where ships were built on a quasi-industrial scale. The Carthaginians had perfected the art of shipbuilding, but this probably had an ecological impact. Whole densely forested areas of North Africa were completely razed to the ground.
In total, the port was home to 220 warships, making the Carthaginian fleet the most powerful in the ancient world. This supremacy, though, was soon to be challenged by a major rival. In 264 BC, Rome would take on the Carthaginian Empire. And the struggle between these two giants would last for more than 2 centuries.
At first, Carthage and Rome had little contact. Rome was a land power based in Italy, and Carthage was a sea power. There was no competition between the two. This changed when Rome conquered the Greek cities of southern Italy, and their gaze then turned to the sea.
When the Romans had the idea to build a navy, they never thought about the navy, in fact. They were people who were more turned to the countryside. They waited until they captured a Carthaginian trireme to replicate it. But having, copies of warship doesn't mean you know how to pilot it.
Polybius, who's our main source regarding the First Punic War, gives the impression that the Romans had no idea about naval warfare. So it's a miracle that they were able to defeat the Carthaginians on the sea. This is demonstrably false. The Romans went into this war very, very well prepared.
And It was a big massacre, and they won a big battle.
Carthage was defeated again in 201 BC after a second Punic War. In two conflicts, then, the Carthaginians lost control of their empire. Faced with the threat from Rome, thousands of inhabitants fled the countryside to take refuge in the city. New neighborhoods sprang up, such as the Hannibal district in Byrsa. The houses were grouped in blocks of about 100 feet by 50 feet and accessible by means of a narrow corridor.
Here, we're in an open courtyard that leads to several rooms. In fact, everything revolves around this courtyard.
No more vast ceremonial rooms. Here, space is reduced to a minimum to cope with the massive influx of refugees.
Some of these rooms may appear small, but don't forget that these houses had several stories. Appian historians of the 2nd century speak of a Punic house in Carthage with 6 floors.
At any rate, Carthage was between the sea and the lake. And I don't think the space really lent itself to any horizontal extension.
The upper floors may have since disappeared, but there are still a few clues to the existence of rooftop terraces, like these terracotta tubes.
We know that in the Punic world, there was a whole system for draining rainwater. So this gutter could certainly support the cisterns with rainwater.
The hill of Byrsa has no water source, so each house had to rely on its own reserves.
Here's a cistern. And you can see on the walls this blue-gray plaster, which provided the waterproofing and was made of a mixture of lime and ashes. It's of a considerable size. The capacity could vary between 20 and 30,000 liters.
Quantities like these make you wonder what the Carthaginians were afraid of.
At this point, they were afraid of a siege, since this neighborhood here was developed in a context of real insecurity. It was the beginning of the 2nd century BC. It was a time of war.
On the other side of the Mediterranean, the idea was gaining ground of putting an end to Carthage.
In Rome, one man absolutely wanted war with Carthage, Cato the Elder, the oldest politician in the Roman Senate at the time. One day, returning from a trip, he showed some huge figs to the Senate, saying, "Just look at the size of the figs in North Africa. As long as Carthage is not destroyed, it will always be a threat to Rome."
They were afraid from this genius, these people who came from nothing. And they knew that if they finished with Carthage, the Mediterranean was open.
Deprived of both their fleet and their army, the Carthaginians left things to the will of the gods. Tanit, the goddess of fertility, or Baal, the supreme god of harvests. While the temples dedicated to them have all disappeared, there's one place shrouded in mystery that has fascinated archaeologists and historians for generations: the Tophet. This open-air sanctuary, oriental in origin, is home to thousands of stelae dedicated to Baal and Tanit.
This huge number of stelae and their inscriptions tell us a lot about the writing, the language, and the religious mentality, all thanks to the Tophet.
Why did the Carthaginians make all these offerings? Not just stelae, but tens of thousands of terracotta urns as well.
In this type of urn, we have children's bones, burnt bones, animals, and sometimes both together in the same burial urn.
How did these children die? Who were they? The ancient Greek texts provide an answer. A macabre custom is said to have led the Carthaginians to offer their first sons as sacrifices by throwing them onto a burning pyre.
Who was sacrificed? Among them could have been children, what we called supposed children. That is, bought from the poor. Or even children who may have had disabilities at birth, etc. In my opinion, well, almost certainly, that's how it must have happened.
Did the Carthaginians really resort to these sacrifices the ancient texts speak of? Within the scientific community, it's still up for debate.
Personally, the things I see here don't confirm the story of blood sacrifices, because analysis of the bones clearly shows that most of the babies were premature.
How can you sacrifice a fetus? He's already dead. Therefore, I'm opposed. Like a lawyer, there is no evidence, none written or pictured, about the sacrifice.
We don't know if this was a smear campaign by the Greeks and the Romans against Carthage, or if it was simply that stillborn children were buried there. We don't yet know enough to make this decision.
The question of sacrifices may not yet be settled, but one thing is certain. In the Tophet, the offerings were multiplying as the spectre of war approached.
And right there is an important clue. The different positions of the urns. They've been tilted, they're vertical, or lying on their side, or sometimes completely overturned, which shows that they were put here in haste. Because here, we're really in the last years of Carthage's life.
149 BC. The legions of the Roman general Scipio surrounded the city. Entrenched behind their strong walls, the Carthaginians prepared for a long siege. It was to last for 3 years.
They had no weapons. They had really to create weapons from nothing. Recycling any piece of iron or whatever, even the hair of the women was used to make ropes. But you know, after 3 years of siege, the people were completely exhausted. And finally, the Romans captured the town. And as usual, you know, wherever the Romans went, they created disasters.
Completely destroyed, Carthage fell. And with it, the Punic civilization.
Carthage was cursed. Scipio Aemilianus was even said to have spread salt on the farmland. Well, that was the legend. It wasn't the case. But the soil really was cursed and was never to be colonized again.
Apparently, even animals were forbidden to enter there. And that went on for a century.
Condemned by Rome to sink into oblivion, Carthage was now nothing but a field of ruins. It was thanks to Rome, though, that it would rise again. In 47 BC, in Rome, Julius Caesar was preparing to take power, which meant that, more than ever, he'd need Africa.
Africa was a very rich province, and the northern part of Africa, above all, produced a lot of wheat.
The 2/3 of the needs of Rome in wheat came from Africa. It was the granary of Rome. Imagine if the food didn't arrive in Rome in time, a Roman emperor could be deposited.
But Caesar was assassinated before he could carry out his plan. Octavian, his adopted son and the future Augustus, inherited the task of rebuilding Carthage.
He honored his uncle by giving his name to the city, Colonia Julia Carthago. So Colonia means what? Inhabited by Romans. Not Phoenicians, any more Phoenicians.
Rome became enormously militarized under Caesar, and when the wars ended, a large part of the troops was demobilized. Augustus had the responsibility here. He had to find land for those veterans. And so a large number of the settlers of Carthage were actually former legionaries.
For the Romans, rebuilding Punic Carthage was out of the question. What they needed was a brand new city.
So the Romans had a big project to build a bigger town than the Punic city. And their architects decided to make of the Byrsa hill as the point zero.
With the help of a groma, a measuring instrument equipped with 4 plumb lines, the Roman engineers traced 2 main roads that intersected at right angles. The Cardo Maximus, over 4 miles long, and the Decumanus, over 1 mile long. The smaller streets were all perpendicular to them.
They adopted the plan of a military camp. Straight streets with numbers.
That had several functions. Firstly, it's convenient. When you know one city, you know them all. You know right away where the important buildings are. But it also contributes to the Roman image. In a way, Rome always established itself abroad by replicating itself.
They spread the Roman way of life. And this kept the empire quieter and more attached to Rome.
On the hill of Byrsa, a gigantic architectural complex was built. In it stood the Forum, a huge square 130 yards long and 90 yards wide.
The Forum was the heart of any ancient city, and Carthage was no exception.
Around this square was built a civil basilica where trials were held, a library, and a temple with 72 columns dedicated to Concordia, the goddess of peace and harmony. These buildings have now disappeared, but their construction has left its mark on the hill of Byrsa. Like these huge pillars that supported the southern slope of the platform. Or the wall of the apse that carried the immense weight of the embankments. The Forum may well have symbolized the power of the emperor, but how could he ensure that Carthage, the capital of the Roman province of Africa, didn't question his authority? The Romans implemented the policy that had already proved its worth throughout the empire: bread and circuses. So they built their incredible constructions: a theater, a circus, and, most emblematic of them all, an amphitheater. The entertainment at this typically Roman venue would often end in death.
Men would fight with animals. Men would fight each other. And of course, the cruelest thing was when people were thrown to the lions.
When you look at the amphitheater, it's majestic, you know. You needed a lot of skill to build an amphitheater. But what happened in has nothing to do with civilization. The massacre of humans.
This not only entertained the people, but it provided them with a metaphor to understand their place in society. The arena was chaos, the public was order, the civilized world. And wherever the Romans went, They exported this form of bloody games.
The remains of the amphitheater give no idea of its gigantic size. All that remains of the building today is the elliptical arena. It measured 30 yards long and 40 wide.
And the word arena, or arena, meant sand in Latin, because the arena was covered by sand to soak the blood of the victims. So the idea is that these were shows, but hiding human sacrifices.
In the center of the arena, this long corridor, originally underground, allowed gladiators, death row inmates, and wild beasts to move around under the building out of sight.
During the show, the whole arena was decorated like a movie set, with little dunes and trees and bushes, and to look like, the bush. But on the sides, you have two openings and lifts to bring out cages, release the panthers or wild boars, whatever, and send back the dead animals to the tunnel.
Of the cavea, i.e. the bleachers, almost nothing remains of the splendor of the past. However, this huge building had 30,000 seats.
So the rich would sit at the front, the middle class higher, they're separated thanks to a balustrade, and much further, the plebeians and the women. The women were not allowed to sit with the men on the front.
The games were held several times a year and were entirely free for the people. So how did the Romans manage to fund such events?
In Carthage, as everywhere in the Roman Empire, there were wealthy citizens who lived much, much better than others. And they were expected to spend part of their fortune to finance the games.
And we imagine, surely, that in the amphitheater, there was a big inscription saying to which emperor he offered it and how much this cost him. In the opening day, he offered food for everybody. They go in these details, and sandwiches and beer and, for everybody. So this is the way the Roman Empire, the Romans didn't pay 1 penny from Rome. The locals who were seeking for honors who paid.
And for these middle classes, sumptuous quarters were springing up. Like here, north of Byrsa Hill. These insulae, islets, measuring 460 by 115 feet, were home to prestigious villas, including the Villa of the Aviary, which was built on several levels and with spacious rooms.
The house occupies an area of about 17,000 square feet, which was about average for the houses of the great Carthaginian notables, especially in this district known as the Roman villas.
Here, it was all about luxury, as evidenced by the marble statues, the colonnades, and especially the mosaics that covered the floors.
So here, these Roman villas are where we find the most mosaics, not only in Carthage, but in the whole of Tunisia. Here, for example, we see this splendid peacock.
The mosaics are composed of tesserae, small cut fragments of stone in natural colors.
Very elaborate mosaics with figurative representations, either animal or human, were very expensive because they took a lot of time and called for a wide variety of stones and colors.
The choice of themes is no coincidence. These images are about much more than just a picture of an animal.
The rich people, they would decorate their dining room with pictures of beasts they offered to the city. This was a big publicity. If I ruined myself or my own town, you have to trust me as a good partner.
With its amphitheater and its opulent residences, Carthage had all the makings of a great Roman city. But to become the Rome of Africa, it would have to face one last challenge: the lack of water. In 128 AD, the Emperor Hadrian traveled to Carthage. The city was suffering from a terrible drought that had lasted for more than 5 years.
When he landed in Carthage, it rained. People liked that, you know. They saw that in him as a good sign. But they asked him things like to build an aqueduct.
For Carthage had no water source, so water often had to be rationed.
Carthage is in the middle of an arid region of North Africa, and such a big city obviously needs large amounts of water to be able to function.
The Romans set out in search of a spring abundant enough to meet the needs of the city. They found it in the Jebel Zagwan mountain range south of Carthage.
It wasn't the closest source because it's about 50 miles as the crow flies from Carthage, but it was the largest and most abundant source.
The water that gushes from these mountains could only be a gift from the gods.
And surely these springs, you know, were considered as divine. Surely there were shrines, there were gods protecting them. And when the Romans came, they built a big temple for water.
This horseshoe-shaped temple is built right over the spring.
It was a grand nymphaeum, or temple of water, made up of 3 big sections. Over there, that's where the statue the whole place was dedicated to stood. It must have been to Neptune, and it was right there the water gushed out. All the pipes ran under this big courtyard.
With a flow rate of about 5,000 to 25,000 cubic meters per day, the water passed through this large basin.
The water had to be seen by the faithful. Indeed, the whole monument was set up around the idea of the strength, the importance of water. The source of life had to be seen before it left for its ultimate destination, and this is where the Carthage aqueduct began.
Consisting largely of a semi-underground water pipe, the Zagwan aqueduct was 82 miles long, the longest in the Roman world. To cross the valleys and rivers, the pipeline is raised on arches, some of which are more than 65 feet high.
Here we're at the lowest point of the route. So that's why the Romans built these arches. The objective of everything they built, whether it was underground or on level ground or up on arches, was to maintain a constant flow of water.
The idea of aqueduct is to keep the gravity, like every kilometer goes down 15 centimeters, so no pumps. So when the land is high, you dig your tunnel, and when you cross a valley, you sustain the pipe, which is built on pillars.
So how did the Romans manage to maintain a constant slope over such a long distance?
The great engineering work that was done was to calculate the slope with an instrument that could be aimed. And that was the work of a team of 2 people who worked section by section to mark out the route of this aqueduct.
They used the shorobat, a ruler with a cavity filled with water with which the device could be kept level. The Romans thus invented the foundations of modern topography.
The aqueducts are perhaps the constructions that best illustrate the superiority of Roman engineering over other civilizations in the Mediterranean world.
When it got to Carthage, the water was stored in a huge reservoir, the Ma'alga hydraulic complex, the most impressive in the Roman world. Measuring 426 feet by 331, it was made up of 16 gigantic cisterns with a capacity of about 50,000 cubic meters of water.
And water could communicate from a room to another, because the water should not stagnate. and wide deep so that the dirt around can buttress the pressure of tons of water. And this also could keep the water fresh.
The Maalga's hydraulic system irrigated the entire city. It was an almost inexhaustible resource that enabled the construction and supply of a huge building down by the sea, the Antonine Baths. This building housed the public baths and was 1,000 feet long and 100 feet high, the equivalent of an 8-story building. They were the largest baths ever built in North Africa.
They wanted to give this impression of monumentality, but more than simply being gigantic, it should reflect the splendor of not only the Roman Empire, but also of the city, which was the capital of their African provinces.
The baths were the cornerstone of Roman life. You would pass through a series of rooms, each with a pool, ranging from the hottest to the coldest. This ancestor of the hammam offered to citizens of both sexes access to both hygiene and comfort.
Baths were absolutely essential for the Romans as part of their personal well-being. And just like the gladiatorial games, admission was usually free.
Even if you're a plebeian who live in a slum, or a peasant who comes from the countryside, bare feet, you can enjoy a fountain, be in a tub, walk on marble, be next to a senator. You enjoy the luxury that you don't have at home. This is what the Romans offered to the public.
This incredible building was spread over 2 levels. Upstairs were the cold, warm and hot rooms for bathing, as well as the sports rooms and relaxation areas. On the ground floor was all the technical equipment. This is where the heart of the hydraulic system was located.
So here we are in one of the gutters that were used for the evacuation of wastewater. The water used in the baths that came from the first floor and down to the basement, through this kind of masonry gutter and towards the sea.
The pools were fed by the city's huge cisterns. And the water had to be brought up to temperature. To do this, the Romans designed an incredible heating system with big fire pits located down in the basement.
We're down underneath one of the heated swimming pools. We know that because here we have a piece of pozzolana stone, imported from Italy. It's a volcanic rock that has the advantage of being both light and very resistant to fire. So this was obviously a place where they used to bring wood to stoke a fire to heat the air that would then be used to heat the rooms above.
Warm air circulated under the pools through a double floor supported by stacks of terracotta bricks. Then it went up into the walls along the pipes, of which these few traces remain.
Here, a little bit of the inside of the wall has been exposed. We can see that the whole wall has been cut and then lifted, and that there were chimneys that allowed the vertical circulation of hot air from the fire pits. So the air was circulating under the ground, but at the same time it was going up through these kind of vertical galleries to heat the walls.
But beyond its technical aspects, it's the sheer size of the building that impresses. How did the Romans achieve such a feat? Thanks to a material that was revolutionary for its time, Roman concrete. A mixture of sand and lime and water.
Lime gradually solidifies over time. And here, the size of the superstructures means there's a pretty heavy load. So this material contributes enormously to the solidity of the whole building.
And that's not all. This material is much stronger than modern concrete, and it offers almost infinite construction possibilities.
The other advantage is that you can make any shape. You make the casing in whatever form you want, and you pour the concrete into it. And once the concrete is set, the casing's removed. It could be in any shape you want.
Without this concrete, building the Antonine Baths would have been impossible. Because the volume of a building like this requires foundations that are absolutely solid.
The floor is made of the same camenticum concrete. In fact, what we see here is a concrete apron, a kind of foundation 4 to 5 meters, about 15 feet deep, that was able to support the enormous load caused by the superstructures, which are very, very high. You can imagine the huge resources that were put into erecting such an edifice.
With the construction of the Antonine Baths, the Romans gave Carthage the prestige that made it the equal of the ancient Phoenician city. But there's one thing they couldn't do, and that was erase all traces of that incredible civilization that dominated the Mediterranean for so long.
Rome's fate hung by a thread during the 3 Punic Wars. Carthage might as well have won them. Ancient history would of course have been totally different. We can only speculate as to what things would have been like under Carthaginian rule. But one thing's for sure, Carthage itself would have had a major role to play.
Even today, on the hill of Byrsa, Punic and Roman remains are intertwined. 2 civilizations forever linked by the incredible history of Carthage.